Good morning. Thank you for coming today. My name is Patrick Doherty, and I am the co-director of the Counterterrorism Strategy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. We have a rather incredible set of speakers and panelists to hear from today, and my job is to make sure that we get through it all on time. So, first, some general ground rules for the day. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones, or put them at least on silent. If I could ask all the speakers to actually turn them off when they're on the podium, because your phones will interfere with the AV system. In the question and answer period, we will have 2 handheld microphones going around the room. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Please identify yourself and any affiliation you may have. Thank you. Finally, we will keep the coffee, tea, and refreshments flowing in the back. If you decide to partake, please try to keep the noise to a minimum and respect the conference. Thank you for your attention. Without further ado, let me welcome Karen Greenberg and Steve Call to the dais. The New America Foundation is grateful to have Karen Greenberg as our partner in what is becoming an annual NYU New America conference. Karen, as you know, is executive director of the NYU Center on Law and Security. And Steve Call, of course, is president of the New America Foundation, my boss and the author of Ghost Wars and the Bin Ladens most recently. Please give them a warm welcome.
We didn't rehearse this, so we'll do our best to get through this quickly and to welcome you. Good morning, my name is Steve Call. I think we're going to have a terrific day here, really, as these things go. Just an extraordinary group of people. And I just wanted to thank, there's a lot of expertise in the room, and so I look forward to your participation as well. I just wanted to thank a few people on behalf of New America, my colleague Peter Bergen, who has done so much to provide the intellectual leadership at our shop on these issues, and whose voice is so important in American discourse these days. Karen, who is our favorite partner, shares our sensibility and our interest in facts first and ideology second, and who has just been an enormous amount of fun in addition to work with over these years. I think this is the 4th of these that we've done together. And they just seem to keep getting deeper in a lot of ways as the subject unfolds. I'd just like to very quickly acknowledge our teams, all of who have helped you get in here and who will help you throughout the day. This is the 2nd day in a row they've been at the Mayflower. We had a conference in this very room yesterday on jobs. So sometimes life at New America is puzzlingly diverse, but they have been terrific both days, and I hope we'll make things smooth for you today. If you have any questions, please ask them. I'd like to also thank our visitors from abroad. The delegation from Saudi Arabia is with us today. It contributed enormously to the discourse in a small dinner last night, and I know have much to say today. We have friends from Pakistan here, General Stone, who will speak shortly, and visitors from Europe. I really appreciate your taking the time. This is a very important time in the United States for this subject. This is a very important but very complicated set of interlocking issues that we're going to discuss today. And I think there's much on the docket, including some contemporary review of important places like Pakistan from very thoughtful analysts. But I think if there are 3 subjects that are terribly important and almost invisible in American discourse about counterterrorism that are going to weave their way through today's discussions, they are the overlapping subjects of de-radicalization, radicalization and de-radicalization, the challenge of post-detention reintegration in all societies, but particularly those now in conflict, and the connection between that reintegration and a broader political strategy of national reconciliation. And those overlapping issues today take us, it doesn't take much thought to recognize, to the most important national security challenges facing the Obama administration, for example, whether or not the president can fulfill his pledge to close Guantanamo in a timely fashion, the outcome of his policy and plans in Iraq, and the outcome of the very uncertain effort to refashion and reapply policy in Afghanistan. Particularly in Afghanistan, this interconnected challenge of reintegration at the local level and political national reconciliation is, I think, critical and undernourished as a proportion of American debate and discourse. And I hope today will at least be a partial contribution to that problem. And I would just close by saying that these issues have certain characteristics in common. I think characteristics that do attract Karen and myself to this work, which is that they are extraordinarily complex. They require engagement with local specificity. This is not work that can be done in a one-size-fits-all model very profitably. And it requires continuous learning. There is no search for a tablet that is going to provide some kind of template that can be applied in conflicts around the world. It's important to understand that these subjects are, in their nature, ones that require continuous learning. And that is another purpose of our gathering today, to share that learning from across national settings and to challenge ourselves to think harder about these very important problems. And with that, I'd like to welcome Karen to the microphone.
Well, it's always hard to follow Steve's call, so I'm going to keep this very short. He said everything I want to say except for a couple of things. First, thank you to the New America Foundation. We love doing this together. It is a lot of fun. Second, I want to reiterate two things that Steve said. The first is that I'm surprised, probably more so than Steve, by the degree to which this conversation deepens every year. 6 years ago, when we started talking about Al-Qaeda, we were talking about very simple, what seemed simple at the time, concepts: war versus crime, the globalized world, transnational terror. Now it turns out that many of the topics that we had separated into distinct conferences, distinct experts, distinct conversations, by which I mean Al-Qaeda, counterinsurgency, the role of interrogation and intelligence, have now sort of collapsed upon one another. And what Steve and I are both trying to do in our own ways is to try to figure out how best to educate ourselves, the policymakers, and the American public about how to think about these issues in a coherent way. Because if only the experts understand how to think about this, it's not going to help us ultimately. This is going to be a journey of public understanding. And we have not had a clear sense of what we're doing for a very long time and of the challenge we face. Which brings me to the title of today's conference, Al-Qaeda and its Allies, the Endgame. I'm not so sure this is Endgame, but I am sure that Al-Qaeda is back on our screen in a way that, I don't know about Steve, but that I am somewhat surprised by. It's back on our screen in terms of our own domestic terrorism trials. It's back on the screen in terms of new venues around the world, be it Yemen or Somalia. And it's something that the Center and probably New America is going to focus a great deal of attention on. The one concept that I'd like you to think about today as you listen to the speakers is the line between terrorism and insurgency. What is that line, and why does it matter? And to come back to where I started, the war-crime dichotomy that was way too simple and tied perhaps to a different century is now morphed and transformed into what the line is between terrorism and insurgency. And the reason it's important to understand that line is that terrorism is something that we have created a number of sophisticated law enforcement, intelligence, and military techniques to address. Insurgency is another matter. And when Steve talks about the local solution to the global problem, it's where the line between terrorism and insurgency bump against one another, and where they cross, that issue becomes most prominent and most problematic. And we don't have the tools yet for addressing it. We don't have the understanding yet of how to do it. And today, I think, is probably the first of many conferences that will be held both privately and publicly around the country, and perhaps beyond that, to try to get our hands around this. So with that, let me just say welcome. I think we're going to have a wonderful day.
So far, we're right on time, so that's excellent. Thank you, Steve and Karen. We will now have a quick situation assessment from Peter Bergen and Shuja Nawaz to set the stage for our day together. Peter Bergen, my partner in crime, and font of all wisdom and knowledge around New America on this subject, is the co-director of the Counterterrorism Strategy Initiative at New America and CNN's national security analyst. Peter will be providing an overview of al-Qaeda worldwide. Shuja Nawaz is director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C. here. His latest book is Cross Swords, Pakistan and its Army and the Wars Within. He's also the author of Fatah, A Most Dangerous Place. Shuja will give us the broad overview of the situation in South Asia. So Peter and Shuja, thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you, Steve and Karen, and thank you for coming today. So I thought I would just give you a very brief assessment of where al-Qaeda is today as sort of a framing for the conference. We called it the Endgame. That might be a bit premature, but I think that one of the themes that will come through today's conference is the extent to which al-Qaeda is losing the war of ideas in the Muslim world, in particular in Pakistan, where after all it's based. So in terms of the threat to the United States posed by al-Qaeda, the organization, I think the threat is essentially at this point close to zero. Al-Qaeda, the organization, has found it very difficult to recruit American Muslims, although there are exceptions to that. The jihadist terrorists, it's very hard for them to enter the United States, and Al-Qaeda itself is weakened. Of course, Al-Qaeda and its allies can kill hundreds of Americans overseas, as we saw with the planes bomb in the summer of 2006. If that had succeeded, 1,500 Americans, British citizens, and Canadians would have been in the middle of the Atlantic. So Al-Qaeda does remain a threat, but I think the threat to the United States has receded. And there are a great deal of pressure points on Al-Qaeda right now. The drone attacks, of course, Catherine Tiedemann, one of the researchers at New America, and I just had a new report out, which is outside on the table. And we found that since 2006, 20 leading members of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban have been killed. The civilian death rate, as opposed to some estimates of being 98%, civilians killed in these attacks, is in fact nearer to 33%, is actually dropping down to perhaps 25% right now. So these attacks have been pretty accurate, and they have put a lot of pressure on the network. One way we measured that was looking at the release rate of Al-Qaeda's propaganda arm. Al-Qaeda takes its propaganda very seriously. In 2007, it had 100 releases. That number went down to 50 in 2008. It's up to about 60 now. So it indicates that in the 2008 period, Al-Qaeda was more focused on survival than propaganda. Another way of measuring it is terrorist plots in the West traceable back to the tribal regions. As far as I can tell, looking at what's out there publicly available, there's only one case of somebody training in the tribal regions since the summer of 2008 who had a serious plan to attack the West. And that is the exception that proves the rule, in a sense, in a number of different ways, because that is, of course, Najib al-Azazi, who traveled to Pakistan in late August 2009, spent several months, returned to the United States he traveled to Pakistan in late summer of 2008, returned to the United States in January of 2009. There he was trained on hydrogen peroxide bombs. This has become a signature of Al-Qaeda plots or Al-Qaeda-related plots in the tribal regions. That was true of this London July 7, 2005 attack, true of the 7/21 attack that wasn't pulled off 2 weeks after 7/7, true of the planes bomb of the summer of 2006, and true of the plot to blow up Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany in 2007. So these kinds of hydrogen peroxide-based bombs is the signature of Al-Qaeda. Najib al-Azazi, I think pre-9/11, would probably have killed scores of American citizens because of the different protocols we now have in place. Azazi was found. It's still not clear exactly why he was discovered. It seems to be probably signals interceptors. If you look at the memorandum of law that was produced when he was arrested, clearly his emails were being intercepted. His travel to Pakistan probably flagged him as somebody suspicious. But the drones have put a lot of pressure on Al-Qaeda. They're a tactic, not a strategy, but they are a somewhat effective tactic. I think the biggest game changer that if we had this conference 2 years ago, I wouldn't have mentioned this, is Pakistani public opinion. What is the center of gravity in the sense of the war on terrorism? At the end of the day, it's Pakistani public opinion. because that's where the Taliban are headquartered, that's where Al-Qaeda is headquartered. And Pakistani public opinion has changed very dramatically in the last few years. Support for suicide bombings dropped from 33% to 5% in Pakistan in the last 5 years. People who regard Al-Qaeda or the Taliban headquartered in Pakistan as a problem has gone up from something like 57% 2 years ago to 86% today. And much as we'll hear from our Saudi friends in a little bit, but it seems to me that what is happening in Pakistan is very analogous to what happened in Saudi Arabia in 2003 and 2004. Essentially, the militants started attacking the state. They very quickly lost popular support. The same process is happening in Pakistan. The Pakistani government, the operations in Swat, the operation now in Waziristan is done with a great deal of Pakistani popular support. We'll hear more from that from my friend and colleague Shuja Nawaz in a minute. This is, I think, a real game changer because previous military operations in Pakistan were seen as, oh, well, we're just doing the Americans' bidding. Now, these military operations are done with a great deal of Pakistani public support. So this is a very substantial change. And is also putting pressure on Al-Qaeda and its allies. And of course, writ large in the Muslim world, the endgame is sort of beginning because the numbers I mentioned on suicide bombing in Pakistan, country after country around the Muslim world, the same support for suicide bombing is just simply cratered in countries like Indonesia and Jordan for the very obvious reason that these groups keep killing Muslim civilians. And then we have a very, very important phenomenon, which is former allies of Al-Qaeda, people that they look to for either military support or for ideological support have turned against them. And one we're very lucky to have my friend Noman Bonoman here in the audience. It's his first trip to the United States. Noman is a former leader of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is, I think, the first affiliate of Al-Qaeda to officially disassociate itself from Al-Qaeda. And Noman, if you'd like to stand up for a second. Welcome to the United States, and Noman is leading that effort. And we'll hear from him later. Which gets to the four strategic problems of Al-Qaeda: killing Muslim civilians, no positive vision, what they're against, but what are they really for. The lack of ability to engage in real politics means that they can't become mass movements like Hezbollah or Hamas, and they made a world of enemies. This is not a winning strategy. It's not a category of institution, person, or government that Al-Qaeda hasn't said it's opposed to. So those are the negatives for Al-Qaeda. Let me just, in conclusion, what are the positives? What do they still have going for them? Well, the most important positive they still have going for them is their leadership is still out there. I mean, if you were trying to look for a bookend to the war on terror, in fact, I'm writing a history, a nice bookend would be the death or capture of Osama bin Laden. But that bookend hasn't happened. And the reason I think that's important is not just the justice for the victims of 9/11. Bin Laden continues, the most reliable guide to what the jihadi terrorist groups will do is what Bin Laden says. That was true 10 years ago, it's true today. So when Bin Laden says we're going to take revenge for the Danish cartoons in 2008, 3 or 4 months later, an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber blows up the Danish embassy in Islamabad. And there are many other examples of Bin Laden actually in videotapes and audio tapes making specific suggestions to people either in Al-Qaeda or affiliated groups that they actually act upon. So when Bin Laden talks about Somalia, as he has recently, it's not surprising that more foreign fighters are showing up in Somalia. So the leadership is still out there. Also, a very important point, Al-Qaeda has hijacked ideologically and tactically many of the South Asian groups we'll hear about later today. The Taliban is moved much closer to Al-Qaeda ideologically and tactically, which is one of the reasons they're doing pretty well in Afghanistan today. Look at Lashkar-e-Toiba in Mumbai, a group that basically had rather parochial concerns about Kashmir, specifically targeting Western and Jewish targets in Mumbai. So Al-Qaeda has been able to turn itself into a form of a mass movement via its ability to control the ideology or influence the ideology of Kashmiri militant groups and the Taliban on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border. And one final point on Al-Qaeda's continued viability, the obituary of Al-Qaeda in Iraq has been written, was very premature. Look at the attack on August 19th in Baghdad, where 2 truck bombs blew up 2 of the most important Iraqi ministries, killing more than 100 people. We were all concerned about violence in the Afghan election on August 20th, when Iraq itself was blowing up. You're still 4 times more likely to be killed in Iraq as an Iraqi civilian today, even with the more peaceful situation, than you are to be killed as an Afghan civilian in Afghanistan. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq is going to be able to exploit very obvious things that are coming up. The problem over the Kurdish issue, this is something that Al-Qaeda will definitely exploit. And Al-Qaeda, there is some evidence there may even be a kind of gentler Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerging. They've put out some messages to their followers, essentially saying, don't worry about some of the social issues that we used to be concerned about, women's head covering and these kinds of things. We essentially have bigger fish to fry. And there's also some evidence that the Baathists are moving closer to the Sunni nationalists, or the Sunni nationalists who were once allied with, who were once opposed to Al-Qaeda, are also getting closer. So these groups are closer together. That gives Al-Qaeda a continued presence in Iraq. And just couple of quick predictions in terms of tactics and targeting for Al-Qaeda. Obviously, commercial aviation remains a very important subject. It's the hardest target, but Al-Qaeda keeps going back to it. And I think it is plausible that over the next several years that Al-Qaeda could bring down some kind of passenger jet with a surface-to-air missile. The reason I say that is that this is not a chicken little scenario. This is a question of capabilities and intent. And we saw that Al-Qaeda almost brought down an Israeli passenger jet in Mombasa, Kenya in 2002. We saw that some kind of jihadist group in Iraq clipped a DHL plane in Baghdad with a surface-to-air missile. We also saw a Sudanese man in Saudi Arabia planning to attack an American military transport in 2002 with a surface-to-air missile. So obviously, if you can demonstrate that you can bring down a passenger jet with a surface-to-air missile, that's a very transformative event on commercial aviation and tourism and the like. The second, of course, more attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets for reasons that are fairly obvious. More attacks on Western brand names, particularly hotels. We've seen a blizzard of those. And finally, something we haven't seen, which I think we would be naive to presume won't happen, is American suicide bombers domestically. The reason I think that this is something we should consider is we've now had 2 American residents or citizens commit suicide overseas in Somalia. And the British were the British had the same phenomenon, but they took the wrong lessons from it. So the British government had officially concluded before the London attacks of July 7, 2005, that domestic suicide attacks by British citizens in the United Kingdom was extremely unlikely. Now, why they came to that conclusion was very puzzling, because they already had a British citizen conduct a suicide attack in Kashmir in 2007. They'd already had 2 British citizens conduct suicide attacks in Tel Aviv in 2003, and they'd already had Richard Reed, who was trying to commit suicide with a shoe bomb on the American Airlines flight from Paris to Miami. So the point is that once you have your own citizens conducting these kinds of operations overseas, it would be naive to think that it's impossible to happen here.
I'm grateful to the sponsors of the conference for inviting me, and I feel a bit like Karen did following Steve Cole. When one follows Peter Berg, and I'm also humbled in many ways by the presence of so many people in the room who are experts truly, not only in this field but in the region that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with a sort of 30,000-foot view and then come down to ground level. The idea being to try and widen the aperture to see what are the influences in South Asia. When I say South Asia, I use a definition that we employ at the Atlantic Council when we set up the South Asia Center, which was you can't look at South Asia on the basis of the old geography books and just look at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan. You have to include Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia. You have to include the Gulf states. You have to include the relationship with the Arabian Peninsula and relationships with Russia and China. So it's a very loose and elastic definition. Why is it that Al-Qaeda is now headquartered in that part of the world? A very simple explanation that I can offer is that it is feeding off the lack of governance, the lack of democracy. It's feeding off fractured polities in individual countries in the region. If you look at the map of the region, wherever there is discontent, wherever there is mismanagement, particularly of economies, you have unemployment. You have a mixture which is very volatile. The mixture is a youthful population in Afghanistan, in Pakistan,
In India, in all the countries, the majority of the population, in fact 70%, in the case of Pakistan, 170 million people, are below the age of 30. And in the federally administered tribal area of Pakistan, which is one of the most backward in terms of socioeconomic indicators in regions within Pakistan, you have female literacy of only 3%. You have about 17% youth budget in the population. That is youth between 16 and 25. And they amount to about 300,000. This is the recruitment pool for the militants, for the terrorists, and increasingly for Al-Qaeda. Also in the region, if you look particularly from Central Asia, where some of the more recent recruits of Al-Qaeda have been coming in, every time there is a crackdown in Uzbekistan, the IMU profits from it. And many more volunteers show up in Pakistan. They find their way because the borders are extremely porous. The same in Afghanistan. When there is no governance, when there is no civil justice available, when the regions find that they have lost their authority, or a centralized authority in Kabul is trying to take over control of the country, you're likely to have a pushback. And there are people in the room who know much more about this, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about it later on. In Pakistan, you have, in the past couple of years, the birth of the Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, which is a homegrown variant of the Taliban movement. But in many ways, it is guided by very different principles. Their aim is to basically take over as much territory within Pakistan as possible and bring it under some kind of a caliphate or an emirate. They have not actively participated on a large scale in Afghanistan. Their focus is primarily on Islamabad. And there is now an increasing access between this group and the Kashmiri jihadi groups. These were the groups that were once sponsored by the Pakistani state, trained by the ISI, and used in Kashmir against India to help the fight against Indian forces in Kashmir. They are now in many ways out of control or in a kind of a limbo, and no attempt was made to think of how they would be demobilized. It was fascinating listening last night to Dr. Saad's presentation, and it's remarkable that in Saudi Arabia they have thought of a whole society approach. None of this thinking is evident. The idea was, well, we'll cut off our ties and maybe these guys will go back to being whatever they were. Well, they didn't have any jobs. There were no training programs. Their families still needed to be supported. And the jihadis that were killed in Kashmir, their families continued to be supported, had to be supported, otherwise they would just add to the pool of recruits. So there has now been an increasing collaboration between the Punjabi Sunni militant groups in Pakistan with the Tehreek-e-Taliban, and this has also taken on a sectarian element. So you have in the federally administered tribal area, for instance, a Shia-Sunni conflict that has been going on for quite some time, as well as on the fringes of Fatah inside the settled areas of the Northwest Frontier Province. And these groups that were trained in bomb making are providing all those skills, the suicide vests, IEDs, etc., to the Tehreek-e-Taliban and making them a much more potent fighting force to contend with. In India, there is, of course, a growing militancy, particularly among the Muslim community, which feels aggrieved and which the Indian government recognized through the Sachar Commission report a couple of years ago. But all that has happened is the formation of some committees, and no real action has taken to try and integrate the Indian Muslim youth into society and to offer them jobs. The dangerous trend now is, following the Mumbai attacks, we see a link between the jihadi groups from Punjab in Pakistan, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc., with Sunni, the student movement of India, as well as with the Harkat al-Jamaat Islami of Bangladesh. Some people have been arrested who have links to these groups and that have participated in the Mumbai attacks. And I see much more than Al-Qaeda being an international force in the region, and perhaps even on a wider scale, these groups taking on as a kind of franchisees of Al-Qaeda because they have a relationship. Peter had mentioned the attack on the Danish embassy, for instance. Interestingly, the car that was used in that attack was stolen from Jhang, which is in the center of Punjab. And even though Baitullah Masood took credit for that bombing, it's unusual to expect somebody to go from the border region to the center of Punjab, steal a car, and then bring it to Islamabad. So clearly there are now franchise arrangements there, and those need to be mapped out and to be looked at. Peter had mentioned the shifting public opinion in Pakistan, and public opinion can be fickle, but I think we are now seeing a trend. There is, as he mentioned, 86% of Pakistanis polled by the International Republican Institute that feel that both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are a serious problem for Pakistan and Pakistani society. Much more interestingly, 90% of the people polled thought that religious extremism is a serious problem for Pakistan. And this is from a country whose image, particularly in the West, tends to be overblown. Every time there is a demonstration against the West or against the United States in particular, all we see are close-ups of bearded mullahs burning the American flag or yelling slogans. What you don't see are the 90% that think that that kind of religious extremism has no place in Pakistan. And there has been no attempt made, either domestically or internationally, to try and bolster that. It's now 8 years after the invasion of Afghanistan, and it's only now that we are looking at many efforts at trying to map the human terrain in the region, find out who the opinion leaders are, find out what makes them tick, and to see if we can bolster those positive trends. The aim has always been to focus on the negative and see if we can try and address those. As a result, what we're finding is that within Pakistan, and now I'm coming down closer to the ground level, you have an extremely volatile and imbalanced political situation. After an extended period of quasi-military rule under an autocratic government that was supported wholeheartedly by the United States and the Western allies, you now have a very fledgling civilian government in place. It is not equipped for the task, and I think most of the people in the government will admit to that. They do not have the institutional memory, they do not have the experience, and perhaps they do not have the will or the foresight to try and look for the longer run. Governments, after they succeed a long autocratic period of rule, tend to be very short-sighted and only want to survive for the next month or 2 or 6 months, maybe a year. And that is the pattern that we are seeing being repeated in Pakistani history. And yes, Pakistan is responsible for that, but the friends of Pakistan that tend to support autocratic rule and continue to support it for short-term regional or strategic interests also have to bear some responsibility and should make an effort to try and fix those problems. Within Pakistan, you now have an extremely weak coalition. It is incapable of decision-making because there are no institutions to support it and because they have not really been able to connect with the population. So, as a default, everything falls back upon what is still the best organized and disciplined group in the country, which is the Pakistan Army. And this is a default option that seems to be taken by most civilian governments. So instead of having a civilian strategy that can be implemented with a practicable roadmap, you have immediately a move to military action. But there is no question of what will happen after the military action. So let's talk about that. We now have had two experiences, one in the settled area of the Northwest Frontier Province in Swat, where the military was sent in after the depredations of the Taliban and their allies in Swat, that had managed to leverage their arms and their violence and to establish control and push out all civilian authority. The military went in last year with one division and cleared them out and couldn't hold. And then the military had to essentially step back into its camps and wait for the Taliban to re-establish control. And they did. So what happened after that? The military was asked to go back in again. No civilian work was done in providing governance or in providing services or establishing policing in the community to isolate the militants. So the military now went back in with something like 54,000 troops. And you needed that quantum of force to clear it the second time. And they've cleared it, but I think people in the military would admit that they are not capable of holding till the civilian counterparts are ready to take over. You now have a situation in South Waziristan where an attempt has been made to isolate a small part of South Waziristan in the Maysood territory to try and make some makeshift alliances with some Maysood tribes as well as with the Wazirs that encircle most of that territory and perhaps even the rather weak Batani tribe which is along the border with the settled area of Northwest Frontier Province. This was a very much announced attack, as those of us that follow the newspapers know. The President of Pakistan, the Interior Minister, had let on many times that the army was about to go in. It was a matter of a week or two. So I believe that the Al-Qaeda leadership and the TTP leadership that we expect to find when the army takes over all the key spots in South Waziristan is probably not there. I believe that they probably either slipped away much earlier and left a rear guard, or that they will be able to slip away by driving the other tribes that are supposed to provide a cordon around this. Pakistan Army now has roughly 2 divisions plus the local frontier corps in South Waziristan. But if you look at the territory and the topography, with an average mountain height of about 2,600 meters, it's going to get very difficult. The United States has not been very active in providing the support that they need for mobility, the helicopters, or even the equipment that they need. Particularly the FC is extremely poorly equipped. So it's, to my mind, even if they occupy the space, it's going to be very difficult to hold. Let me just stop here with just 2 points on what we might expect next. To add to Peter's fears, I fear that there may be a use of dirty bombs. And I fear that the Al-Qaeda franchisees, particularly in the West, and particularly in Britain, are likely to be involved in some of those because they've been exploring all these options, and it's a question of getting access to some of the nuclear materials. And that's something that we need to address in the West, where the most likely sources of material will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shuja. Thank you, Peter. We have time for just a few questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. All questions for Peter over here. The head of the table.
Ali Ahmed from the Gulf Institute. Richard Holbrooke recently said that the majority of the funding for the Taliban comes from the Gulf country. He didn't mention, he refused to name them, but everybody believes in Saudi Arabia. The fact that we know that Taliban is also raising a lot of money in Saudi Arabia, and the Taliban leaders have made Saudi Arabia free, basically, and they even become, some of them are guests of the king. Why has that changed? Why the United States and Pakistan, for that matter, have not dealt with this issue 8 years after September 11? Why is that going on?
I think the Taliban has many sources of income. Obviously, the poppy and opium is one of them. I would also add kidnapping, very important. When the Italian journalist was kidnapped in Helmand 3 years ago, my understanding is the Italian government paid $2 million. $2 million is a lot of money in Helmand. Yes, there are probably zakat donations that are collected in Pakistan for the Taliban. They're collected perhaps in other countries in the Gulf. But no one really knows, to be honest. I mean, right now there is a new task force that's been set up in Afghanistan to look at some of these questions to get a better handle on it. Ambassador Holbrooke has certainly said that the drug proportion of the Taliban income has been perhaps exaggerated. But I think that it's quite a murky picture. And just as Al-Qaeda in Iraq was able to raise a lot of money, both overseas but also domestically through kidnapping and extortion and other criminal activities, the Taliban, which in some ways is operating more like the FARC in Colombia, in some places in Afghanistan, is doing the same thing.
I'll just add a few words. I think we have to recognize that the Taliban are a Pashtun phenomenon, and there are 40 million Pashtun around the world, particularly in the region and in the Gulf. There are about 4 million in Karachi alone, and they are very gainfully employed. And so there is a lot of contribution that is coming from Pashtuns. And this is not simply an Afghan problem. This has to be an issue that has to be resolved in Afghanistan, obviously, but only then will the flow cease. So it's not necessarily only from the Arabian Peninsula that financing is coming in. And I think certainly not from official sources any longer.
Thank you, Shusha. Over here. Thank you. And then we can take the stage for questions.
Thanks. Indira Lakshman from Bloomberg News. Taking the situation assessment that you both described, what do you see as the best things that the U.S. government can do to try to influence specifically in South Asia? And I'm particularly interested in your assessment of what President Obama should do in terms of advising his Afghan strategy, particularly with respect to U.S. troops. Thank you.
Can I just make an observation, not about troops? I think, I've been in Afghanistan repeatedly on embeds where, starting after 2001, where the military commanders will say, we're doing a hammer and anvil strategy. Well, I can tell you there's never really been a hammer in Afghanistan, and there's never really been an anvil in Pakistan. But now there is. And so, whatever position you take on the number of troops, and I don't take one, discussions about us perhaps ratcheting back our commitments or not being there for the long term are enormously counterproductive because the Pakistanis, for their own purposes, are forming that anvil as we speak. And so I think that what the President needs to explain as often as possible is that our commitment is for the very long term in Afghanistan, whatever the number of troops, because that affects the hedging strategies of Pakistan. If Pakistan feels that the United States and its allies are in Afghanistan for some limited period of time, why would they take the Afghan Taliban card off the table? It's a card that they will continue to sort of want to play perhaps, but they will certainly want to play it if they feel that the American effort there is limited.
I think we have to recognize that it makes no sense for Pakistan, which has an overstretched military already, to open a new front against the Afghan Taliban. They already have a huge battle for Pakistan raging inside the country. And this is likely to get much worse before it gets better. My suggestion to President Obama would be to try and widen the discourse and bring in India also, and bring in China, and bring in Iran into this dialogue to see how this situation in Afghanistan can be resolved, because it's certainly not something that only Afghanistan and Pakistan can resolve. It's a time for a much stronger government in New Delhi to show some strategic altruism, to be able to build the confidence of Pakistan so that it can now take more troops away from the eastern border without trying to cannibalize its forces that are already in the western region.
Last question right here.
Hi, Billy Congressman John Kerry's office. Peter, back to your point about domestic terrorism and counterterrorism in the U.S. I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of the things that are going on in Minnesota, Minneapolis, the Somali community, the Shabbat, whatever, it's affinity with
You know, what's interesting, I mean, we'd had this conversation a year and a half ago, and I think there was a lot of reason to be both congratulatory and perhaps complacent about the threat from domestically. But if you take together the cases that we've seen in the United States in the last year and a half, the Little Rock, Arkansas case, where a guy, an African-American convert to Islam, who, by the way, changed his middle name to Mujahid, indicating perhaps where he was coming from, he then attacked a military recruiting center and killed an American soldier. It's the first successful jihadist terrorist attack since 9/11. Take that together with the dozens of Somalis from Minnesota and other places who've gone to Somalia, 2 of whom conducted suicides, we've already discussed. Take that together with the North Carolina case, where it seems that people were really seriously casing Quantico Marine Base. Take that together with the Venus case, the Long Island kid who converts from a Hispanic kid who converts to Islam, goes to an Al-Qaeda training camp in 2008, conducts a rocket attack on an American base. And then of course Najib al-Azazi. What do these cases have in common? They have almost nothing in common except one thing, and this is merely a hypothesis, not. These cases, the people involved in them look a lot like the European Muslim community. Think about the Somali American community, the Afghan American community, a convert, an African American convert to Islam who gets religion in prison. These are people who are not enjoying the American dream. They look much more like European Muslims. They look much more like the European Muslims who are less well educated, have less good employment prospects, and don't really enjoy and live in ghettos. So this is merely a hypothesis, but I think certainly these cases are more real, these more recent cases, and they also look a lot more like the European Muslim cases.
Thank you, Peter and Shuja. We're now going to move on to our next panel. And I'd like